Hey, thank you. Let's go ahead and get started again. We're here for the featured speakers now. So I'm really happy I get the chance to introduce everybody. So I'm going to go over everyone's bios and then hand things over to Amy. Is Amy here? Oh, you want to come up? First of all, I'd like to introduce Mike Belding. Mike graduated from Waynesburg Central High School in 1981 and attended Penn State University. Upon graduation in 1985, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, and he served nearly 3 decades as an aviation officer, strategic planner, and analyst, retiring as colonel in 2012. Mike has a BS in agricultural science from Penn State, an MA in management from Webster University, and an MS in national security strategy from the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Mike. And next I'd like to introduce Veronica Coptis, who is the former executive director of the Center for Coalfield Justice. Veronica is currently the senior advisor for Taproot Earth. For over a decade, she has been organizing to build power for coalfield communities by listening to directly impacted people and investing in their leadership to have the agency improve their environment and economy. Veronica transformed the Center for Coalfield Justice to be rooted in local community members' experiences and led by those most impacted by the intersections of environmental and economic injustice. Veronica is a proud first-generation college graduate with a degree in biology from West Virginia University. Veronica lives in Southwest Pennsylvania with her husband and her 2 children. So welcome, Veronica. And lastly, I'd like to welcome Tonya Yoders, who is the Greene County Organizer for the Center for Coalfield Justice. Tonya was born in Greene County, and she lived there her whole life until 2021. Most of her family still lives there. She has worked in healthcare, retail, pharmacy, direct support, and legal assisting, most of which were in Greene County. She moved to the neighboring county of Washington, where she currently resides, but she would one day love to see her home county thrive so she can live there again. And I'd also like to introduce Professor Amy Moran Thomas from Anthropology. Amy is Associate Professor of Anthropology here at MIT. She is interested in the human and material entanglements that shape health in practice. Amy received her PhD in anthropology from Princeton University. Her writing often focuses on the social lives of medical objects. She also works on the cultural anthropology of intergenerational health, planetary change, and chronic conditions, as well as questions of equitable device design, technology and kinship, and the afterlives of energy across scales. Her first book, Traveling with Sugar: Chronicles of a Global Epidemic, examines the global rise of diabetes as part of the ongoing legacies of sweetness and power, including how unequal access can shape how histories live on in the present, impacting lives and landscapes across generations. So welcome, Amy, and with that I will hand things over to all of you for our conversation.
So I'm so glad for the invitation to be here with you all, and I was asked to sort of open up part 2 of today's event before we transition into the conversation we're also excited for. To spend a few minutes just offering a few stories about how these stories from Greene County position all of us in different ways and trying to think about some of those interconnections. And I really like this term, connected histories, that anthropology reminds us to pay attention to. Sort of the ways any life is materially connected to the lives of many others in ways we might not always see. A little reverb. Thank you. So that was something I always noticed as a kid moving between Western PA, where my parents' family was from, and the town outside Philadelphia where I grew up. And if anyone's seen the HBO show Mary of Easttown, it's been a funny year watching Kate Winslet attempt to learn the Delco accent. I've spent a lot of time trying to unlearn, but that's a story for another time. But this is my grandmother, who worked in the West PA mills that made steel out of coke and coal. sometimes she used to dress me up as she dressed herself, like Rosie the Riveter. Driving to West PA to visit family in summer is obviously a very different thing than growing up there. But it did teach me to better see some of coal's connected histories in the world, and the ways those interconnections often get misrecognized and even denigrated. So this is the coal mine where her father worked, 1 county over from Greene. When I took this picture a couple years ago of the toxic orange runoff from the coal face that my great-grandfather had mined, I felt at once so connected and so disconnected from that legacy. Connected because it's not often that I am able to stand in the exact place I know one of my ancestors stood working. But disconnected because those that inherited the problem of this runoff were the people who still live there, whose water that was to drink and whose backyards that was. And so it was a reminder for me of the responsibility of all of us moving forward to think about these inheritances of coal as places the material and the social are often impossible to pull apart. So one other note, in my family's case, these legacies include ways that coal has divided as well as connected people across lines of difference in history. So some of my ancestors mined along the Kittening coal seam, which was named for the Lenape and Shawnee village Kittening that was burned to the ground by a general named Armstrong. And the coal and later gas extracted from that seam is still today burned in a generator named for Armstrong. And for me, it's a reminder of all the ways these histories are sort of alive in the landscape in ways we don't always understand, but that continue to shape the present and future. So this is my mom's grandfather, who's a miner in Johnstown. That's another story for another time. But coal's connected histories are around us here at MIT too, as they are most anywhere. So during the time coal mines in PA supplied energy and materials all along the East Coast, one of its largest customers out of Pennsylvania's coal port of Port Richmond was Boston. So those legacies are part of the landscape all around us if we learn to see them. Bunsen burners, which shaped so much landmark chemistry and science here, were powered by coal gas. Many of the medical devices that I study in my work now, and that so many people at MIT are thinking about, many of those came from coal mines, including the respirators that have become vital public health tools. And the legacies of coal are with us in every road paved with asphalt and bituminous tar, in the buildings made of carbon forged steel and other mine products, and every light switch flicked on, even if, as on our campus here, there's been work to transition away from coal power, in which case there's not a working mine, but a closed mine that marks those connected histories. And that search for green technologies, often relying on rare earth metals, as John mentioned earlier, keeps reminding us these stories about the unequal stakes of mining are far from over. Once I met a programmer who was hired to teach coding to former miners in Greene County. This was more than a decade ago. And the project failed, he told me, because the policymakers who imagined this program from afar hadn't planned for the ways most of the individuals they were trying to recruit wouldn't take the job unless others in their union could also be hired. To me, it was a reminder of how technology and policy solutions imagined from afar so often don't work in places they're meant to be put in practice if there's not co-envisioning led by the community that acknowledges and is centered on people. And connected histories is more than an afterthought, but the primary factor in how many programs and policies work or fail in practice. And this was my daughter, as school made this for Earth Day this year. But it was a reminder to me, too, that I'll one day soon need to explain to her these headlines like these from 111 years ago, sort of. So today, headlines on climate planning and adaptation are often framed around the future of cities. This UN document is just one example. And of course, these visions are crucial for many people and plans in the world. But sometimes you'd think from such documents that the only human future is in cities. It's also important to hold in mind that when policymakers envision technological solutions for a world able to function because there are increasing populations in cities, between the lines of such visions are often an unspoken specter of other towns and communities imagined as increasingly depopulated. Policymakers need to remember these are connected histories too. People don't all live in cities, and those communities also have futures. So of course, all of this is stating the obvious to many in this room today, but these are just a few of the reasons we're excited to welcome today's panel for a chance to hear how people from a particularly impacted county in the historically emblematic coal county of Pennsylvania are working together to imagine such a future, to envision what a just transition would mean for their community, and how the stakes of this particular local experience may resonate more broadly for those around the country, even the world, facing shared dilemmas. So with that, I'm excited for this chance to open up our conversation with our panelists. So if I could kick things off with an invitation for each of the panelists to respond to the title, The Legacies of Coal. What do the legacies of coal mean to you and your community? We'd love to hear a bit about each of your work in relation to those questions.
Sure, I'll start. So yeah, the legacy of coal in Greene County is the foundation for the community, really. I wouldn't deny that at all. The county was built on farming and coal. And my work right now is informing residents on how we can move forward and progress, while also just honoring the heritage of our ancestors. We support people around black lung and its effects and other harmful health effects that happen from it, from the industry and other industries like oil and gas. And I think that's possible, that we can both honor the sacrifices that past Greene County residents made, while also looking forward to the future and trying to come up with solutions.
Having a diverse experience, first leaving the county for 30 years, I traveled all over the world, visited 42 countries, some of them friendly, some not so friendly. And came back home and was extremely disappointed in the lack of progress in Greene County after my 30-year absence. So I took a little bit of time to travel around, being retired and so forth, and I got involved in county government. My training in the military, to include being a pilot and an analyst and a researcher, brought numbers forward that I think most people had never looked at before. They were available. Veronica reminded me they used to have to do right to knows to get all the statistics that they wanted to pull out of the assessment office or county government or something. My perspective was always, as a county leader, to make those transparent, accountable, and so forth. So we took took some time to take a look at that. And the story, the legacy of coal in the economic perspective, is a tragedy. And although coal did really well for Greene County for 120 years, in the 2012 to 15, because of lack of previous administration's acknowledgement of the fate of the asset, right? So every time you take a coal car load of coal away, the next year you don't get the tax value of it. And that was predictable. It was obvious what was going to happen. And I call it the fat, dumb, and happy. And that's not it's a cliche, not a derogatory, that as things were good, nobody paid attention to the future and the economic downfall that was predicted. And Greene County's not alone in that. You can look at Tennessee and Kentucky and Pittsburgh as well, in other single source economically driven economies. We use coal obviously because that's our the product that we do. But at one time, 50% of the county's income was based on the value of coal underneath the ground. Now it's down to about 30%, and there's a precipitous decline in the future as coal mines become inefficient, unminable, or the resource is no longer needed, right? Supply and demand. So that the scale tipped in about 2015 with the closure of 5 of 9 mines, and it's down to 30%. That 20% delta of traditional tax revenue has not been replaced by anything. And that's where you see each individual property owner bearing more of the responsibility for paying taxes, right? The government, school districts, and municipalities didn't get cheaper to operate. They got more expensive to operate. And as a sole source of traditional tax revenue, the tax structure now requires individuals to pay more. And we hear terrible stories about widows or widowers choosing between paying their taxes and buying medicine, paying their taxes and buying insurance right? And we're literally taxing people out of their properties that they have not owed a mortgage on for 30 years. So the analyst part and the statistical part, I worked a lot of this to come to several conclusions, which I'll share throughout the rest of the process here. There are no simple solutions, and there's not a one solution fits all. And thus, the organizations that I try to work with to include industry advocates and workforce development and opportunities to keep people in the county so that tax burden is shared on a larger population. But the real solution to our economic crisis right now is a infusion of unlikely participants in taxable activities, right? So the statistics bear out that we're $100 million short of taxable assets in Greene County to balance the budget in the future. So that's like 32 Walmarts, okay, in value. We have one, and we don't need any more, right? That's like $203 Generals. Now, we have about 2 dozen of those, but we don't need any more, right? So what is the taxable asset that is built that's industry related to secure jobs, develop a workforce that can transition from coal mining to whatever that is going to be? And we go through all these discussions. But the real economic crux right now is the decline of traditional tax value in the coal and not having a replacement for it.
So I think I echo a lot of what Tonya and Mike have shared. And I do think it's important to note that coal was, what is the lessons to learn from our legacy of coal? Coal was an asset. It was a resource to our community. It sparked growth and migration to the region during the Industrial Revolution. Many of the nationalities and ethnicities that exist in Greene County came from Eastern Europe and immigrated there to work in the mines, or recently freed slaves migrated further north to work in the mines. And that migration to that resource is what built our communities, and also the history of resistance, right? There's this glorified story of how coal started in our county and it was great and it built us, and it's not that pretty. Coal barons, outsiders came in, extracted these resources, forced workers in horrible conditions in company towns on company script. And what is the lesson there? What happened in that era was that workers, families, churches, civic groups all came together and pushed back against that unequal power dynamic and said, no, you won't own us. No, we won't have a company town. And that was the birth of the labor movement, right? If anybody is here in a union, that came from Appalachia, from southwestern PA, because they stood up and fought for better labor conditions. In my work now, right, so I was directing the Center for Coalfield Justice for about the last 6 years, and now I'm with Taproot Earth, and we're building power and cultivating solutions among frontline communities to advance climate justice and democracy. Our role is to create a new path for waters to flow, to build bridges to our collective vision, and to create a world where we can all live, rest, and thrive in the places we love. I think Yaron really gave a beautiful depiction of home and what people care about. And that's not just what people in Greene County want. I'm sure that's what you want. I'm sure that's what everyone wants, right? They want to be able to survive and thrive in the places that you care about. And so my work now is to look at these lessons, right, from history, what happened, what power went unchecked, how we challenged it and built it. And we're sitting now, Mike depicted a dire, grave situation economically for the county. And for a lot of folks, they may sit and be like, that's too big. And this is not unlike the conversation we heard last night, right? Addressing climate change. Wow, how can I even do anything? That's too big. But all we really have to do is look back into history. There's always been times when there was massive power inequity, massive economic inequity, and people worked across difference, came together, aligned, and tried to figure out where there was commonality to shift the system. And so I think as we move forward, right, not immediately Greene County is not an attractable place to live, but when we topple the impacts we know we're gonna see of climate change in the coming years, where communities are gonna become unlivable, our region is predicted to be one of the most livable places in the nation. And that migration that we will then see to this region, again, like we saw 200 years ago, can happen one of two ways, right? That migration can happen inequitably, again, or it can happen equitably. How do we create structures? How do we rewrite the system for people to thrive so that when that happens, we can be accepting of folks who need safe haven to survive, to thrive, to live, without displacing the people who have been through the thick of it for the last century, right, for the last 20 years, and our communities. And so part of what I do now is to facilitate these discussions, still do leadership development around it, but really uplifting the most impacted to think creatively around solutions of how do we develop our future where people are collectively controlling and operating our rights to water, land, and energy. Because no one can survive in the future if they don't have access to water, a home, land, food, or energy to survive. And so that I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. And also that is what, right, the Economic Diversification Steering Table, we mentioned it was a diverse group of people. I mean, it was an environmental justice advocacy organization and a coal company sitting at the same table, and the Chamber of Commerce and government and service workers, right? Like that's unheard of in today's time of division, to see these people look the other way where we disagree and come together where we can agree, right? There's a common problem we're all in, and how do we solve this together? And we can figure out what we all think about Reggie, right, down the line later on. Going forward. And so I just think we need to recreate that more and more in many communities, right? This isn't just a problem for Greene County. This is a problem communities across the nation, across the globe are facing day in and day out.
Yeah, just to back that comment up, I use the word tragedy. Veronica used the word crisis. Either one, there is no better time to bring a team together when they face a crisis or tragedy. Right? When times are good, everybody wants to be on their own. Not cooperating with everybody, not coordinating. But when they recognize the magnitude of this issue, I think everybody needs to come together and put their differences aside, whether it's industry, government, regulation, environmental advocacy. We're all in this together, and we need to solve it together.
And that last set of responses reminds me that I think many people don't know the rights of nature movement that has now become, so globally visible in, Ecuador and around the world, but actually started in PA coal law. And so, the Veronica, your response in particular seems like a great segue to what we wanted to offer as the next question, just for each of the panelists to respond to the question, what would be your ideal vision of a just transition?
Yeah, so my ideal vision for Greene County would just be a place where people from all different backgrounds can thrive in the area, one where everyone is paid fairly and treated with dignity, and that we don't have to work in an industry that harms our environment and health. Just growing up in Greene County, our options were limited. My options were limited. We've said before, we've talked about it at CCJ, that My options were like healthcare mostly I had to go into. For men, it was like military, the coal mine, oil and gas, and that was pretty much it. And so I felt like growing up, I had to either be like a stay-at-home mom or work in the healthcare, and that was my only option. And so I would love to see Greene County become a place where there are more options. I think that we could lean into our natural like beauty of the area and become a place for tourism. And I think we could maybe become a hub for some kind of remote work that kind of grew during the pandemic, and I think that it could be a really good place for that. And I just want people to feel safe and secure enough to stay. I tried as hard as I could to stay, and then a couple years ago I had to move. But like I said in my bio, I wish I could go back. So.
I agree wholeheartedly with all those comments. One of the struggles we have is, for a variety of reasons, is a decrease in population. So we've lost 7.2% over the last 10 years. Mostly young folks. And every time an 18 to 25-year-old leaves, the population ages more than just one person, right? Because the elderly stay. And so there are complications with that. Some I described earlier about the taxation. We're taxing individuals out of their properties. The just transition that I try to focus on back in the economic and the role of government is stabilizing what we have right now. We're on a significant decrease in everything that you can imagine, from social standards to the level of education, the population, job opportunities, the diversity of the environment. We compete with our neighbors very poorly. We have taxed ourselves above our neighbors to the north in Pennsylvania. And as one of the introductions mentioned, we're bordered on two sides by West Virginia. And the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is not business friendly, not anywhere close to that of West Virginia. So if you want to be in the southwest of Pennsylvania, you're likely going to build a business in West Virginia and operate across the state line. We have the second highest fuel tax in the United States. We can't, if you're going to have a fleet of vehicles, you're going to deliver anything, you're going to receive supplies, that matters. And we have the second highest corporate net income tax in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In West Virginia, we can't compete, right? So this just transition, I think the first thing is we have to stop the bleeding, right? Go back to your CPR type of stuff. And what's most important is stabilizing what we have, looking for opportunities to use the assets that we have on the ground. A lot of these brownfields that were left over from coal industry and related industries have electric substations available, right? They're right in the grid because of the power requirement that was there for the previous industry, and that not be a solar field. Now you're pumping energy into the grid rather than taking it out as the previous, the reason for that brownfield. But, stabilize things at where we're at, look at the assets that are on the ground, what's the next best thing to include technology, retrain workforce. I think we're at 3.5 or 3.7% unemployment right now. It's not like we have a pool of extra people out there that are going to go to work. So as we transition, instead of those individuals leaving the county for better jobs, we need to offer them jobs in the county and retain them. Our community technology college or community technology center for the high school folks, the old VOTEC, has done really well in adapting their curriculum to keep children, young people at home. So they started a CDL program, 18-year-olds, when you graduate, you can operate within the confines of the Commonwealth, you can't cross state lines. So they've done really well in trying to, we have an LPN program as well, to keep people in the local area. We still precipitously lose those individuals. And somebody brought up broadband, I think Tonya. This was one of my pet projects, and Greene County leads rural installation of broadband in Pennsylvania. We've never led anything in our lives before, on the positive side, right? So we've invested of other people's money, $9 million in broadband installation since 2020. And gathering industry partners, federal grants. We use an Appalachian Regional Commission competitive grant. That $9 million has brought broadband access to close to 11,000 residents, businesses, and industry in Greene County of a population of 36,000. So that's a pretty big dent over 3.5 years in making that available. Put COVID in there and the opportunity for people to get out of the big cities, we should be able to operate or offer remote work from Greene County. In a lot of cases we can, but we go back to this tax issue of how much do you want to spend, where you could live in Washington. So there are issues like that, but one of the opportunities we present is opening up the opportunity to work anywhere in the world in this rural but reachable county in Greene County.
So every time I get asked this question, right, like I've been asked it a million times, what's your vision of just transition? The first thing, and I think is really particularly right now when we have a political moment where the most money our country has ever seen in my lifetime is to move to projects like this, is like lesson one is like a just equitable transition is never fast. If it is fast, then you're leaving someone out of the mix, right? Someone is not being included, some inequity, some harm is still happening. And I just want to name that because I think we're in a moment where we have a government who's saying, go as fast as you can, spend this money as fast as you can to show progress. And that's not going to actually be a just transition. There will be transitions, right? But will they be equitable is the big question around that. And then I also think, right, we're listening to huge problems on how do we transition, how do we include everyone. And I think we really need to look at this opportunity to identify that our just current economic system at large does not work for most people in this country, in our county. And in this moment, how do we actually rethink how we shift our current governance and economic systems, both at the local level, to the national, to the global levels, and how do we shift that so it's in right relationship with people in nature and not just greed and as much profits as possible that's happening. And we can do this, right? We're so often individuals, it's hard, right? I want to say this is not an easy task. It's really hard in our current economic conditions to not be sitting in the feelings of scarcity and competition and who has it better, who has it worse. And we really have to shift our thinking and shift our way at looking at the problems and centering the solutions by moving with abundance and love and healing to get to a just transition that require us to embrace solutions rooted in community, accountability, and justice. And this starts at the hyper-local level, right? Like, if you can't do this at a township or county level, then there's no way you're going to do it successfully at a state level, at a national level, at a global level. So starting locally, building these relationships, taking these lessons learned all the way up to the global scale. And I think that's the biggest lesson I learned when I started to just be impacted by coal mining was how globally connected it is, right? We talk about the impacts of coal in Greene County, but when you trace where that money is going, right, that resource is going, I thought growing up in a tiny little town in western Greene County, I never would have to think about Asian coal markets. Well, guess what? Those Asian coal markets were indeed what was expanding the operation that was impacting my life, right? And so we can't pretend in our world in today's age that what happens in Graysville, PA doesn't have an impact in Dubai or Ethiopia or South Africa, right? It is all connected. And I keep thinking a lot about what John said about, just transition isn't also just a move to solar. Like solar panels would be great, but the question is, who's benefiting from the profits of those solar panels? And I think we could very easily, in this climate crisis, move to a renewable energy grid, a renewable energy system, and the problems would still be the same. Some individual owns all of the renewable operations, takes all the profit and resources out of wherever the resource is being placed or the wind is blowing, and you still have a community without a taxable base, a community without investment into the resources. So just transition has to have this community dynamic interplay, and it also means some people who have more than others are gonna have to figure out what's actually sustainable when we're on a planet where resources are dwindling, but there is actually enough for everyone, right? There's not enough for one person to have a million billion of those resources, but there's enough for everybody to actually have what they need. And then the thing about the immediate harm that I don't think we focus in a lot for very political reasons, this has not been done, is the care economy, right? Mike mentioned the low unemployment rate. More employees in Greene County work in the care economy than any other sector in the economy. They're teachers, they're healthcare workers, they're taking care of their kids or their aging parents. Our aging infrastructure or aging population is increasing, and so the fastest sector that is going to grow in the next 10 years is the service worker sector, the care sector. But right now, those jobs are undervalued, not dignified, and underpaid. And so if we switch that mindset, right, like it's just as honorable to be a healthcare worker as it was to be a coal miner, then we could see a drastic change in mentality. And if we pay those jobs if we unionize those jobs, right, we could see quick, immediate benefit to residents, which then gives them more money to pay taxes, but also gives them more time to like actually tackle this problem, right? The majority of our county doesn't have the privilege of time to sit at tables like Tonya and Mike and I can to be like, oh, here's this problem, what do we figure out? They're grinding to figure out how they don't get evicted from their home, how they don't lose their they don't miss their mortgage payment and lose their home, or not be able to pay their taxes, right, and have to move. And so I just think you have to meet people's immediate needs to survive, and then they can come to the table, right, to figure out how do we actually switch the whole system.
And this was already in so many of your responses, but that kind of moved beyond a framing of deficit and sort of talking about how to honor the dignity of different work and think about healing and repair. The next question, picks up on Becky. What do you love or appreciate about your community? What would you like people to know about?
Yeah, so I love how people in Greene County just naturally come together when a need arises. The community just naturally organizes itself. For example, if like a child gets cancer, they organize spaghetti dinners like automatically. They don't even question it. And I want people to know how resilient people are in Greene County. We've been through tough times and tough situations, and we get through it. And I just want people to know that it's a beautiful area, and we just need to be listened to and not ignored. And there are great people within the community, and we just need help and resources to be able to reach our full potential, because we have some really intelligent, great people in the area, and not a lot of people take the time to think about that.
Nicely said.
Thank you.
I think the capture of family and home are synonymous with Greene County, and that was one of the reasons I brought a 8th and 9th grader back after 30 years of traveling around the United States, and allowed them to have 3 or 4 years before they went off to school to experience what I experienced growing up, and that was the same. So I complain about nothing happened in 30 years. That was a good thing if you were sending kids to high school, right? We didn't transition in a negative way like a lot of communities have over time with different social issues and drugs and so forth like that. So that definition of family and home I agree with. The outdoor, recreational, festivals, all of those things are integrated in the traditions of Greene County, and people look, the week-long county fair. If you want to find somebody in Greene County, spend 2 days at the fair and they'll walk by you, right? So those kinds of things that hold people there. But it's really hard to invite somebody from South Hills, south of Pittsburgh, and say, come down to the Greene County Fair, you're going to have a blast. It only costs you $10 to get in the gate. You can be there for 6 or 8 hours. It's money well spent, but that doesn't transition people that are not used to that heritage or that past to entice them to stay in Greene County, right? So we need to retain that family, the people that value those kinds of things, and let them grow their families around us. There's nothing I like to see more than, so somebody my age, maybe we have 25 and a 27-year-old, and you break off a piece of property and they put a house on it. Right, so now you're close to your grandkids, they're paying taxes, they're stabilizing the population and they're putting back into the economy. And there's opportunities to do that around Greene County because of the rural nature of our county. But it's a hard sell for outsiders, not a good word, unfamiliar people, right? People that are not familiar with our heritage and our background and stuff, it's a hard sell to get them into Greene County. But once you're there, you're gonna love it. You just gotta come visit.
I mean, my answer is mostly the same, right? Like the people, the story I always tell of just like, and I think if you grew up in a city, just the compassion and to help. And some of you may remember, it was like several years ago when Pennsylvania got a massive snowstorm, dumped on it. I think we got like 3 or 4 feet of snow. My car got stuck in Waynesburg. I lived 14 miles west and I couldn't get it out. And my neighbor took his tractor and drove it 14 miles, shoveled out my car so I could go to work the next day, right? So just this like culture of care that is kind of there naturally, and it's there out of necessity often too, right? It really hit me hard when you're talking about the UN report and the future of cities and everything's focused on cities, and it's like rural communities are so resilient because they've never been focused on like ever in our history. And so that culture of care is there because we don't have community centers. We don't have the social services, right? We don't have a good access to healthcare. We don't have these things that are just second guessed a lot of times in cities that are so right there that the neighbors have to help one another out. The grocery store is 30 minutes away. So instead of driving 30 minutes, you just go ask your neighbor if they have some milk and they give you some milk. And you may vote for totally different people. You may not actually deeply like each other, but when you need something, they're like, yeah, here, sure, I'll do it, right? So, and I think there's a lot to learn, right? How are we reshaping our communities based off how rural communities are already operating deeply in this, culture of care to take care of one another out of necessity. And there's a lot I think I just really want people to listen before they are not from a community, right? I would also never go into a city and be like, I know what all of y'all think, right? I don't know what your lived experience is. And so I just think the lesson in return, if you're going to a community in which you've never been in before, is to listen and not make assumptions and not just believe everything you read in the media, right? Or what your friend told you about something too. Because I think there's a lot of stereotypes that can happen, particularly for folks in Appalachia, as dumb, right? Like they don't know any better, they're being manipulated, like they just vote against their interest, right? Why is that happening? And that's where the New Yorker article came out, right? There was this whole narrative of Appalachia about they just like all voted for Trump against their interest, and it's this monolithic ideology that exists in the community. And that's what I want you to realize. Like, it is not a monolithic of anything besides maybe a single source dominated economy, but like the people have a lot of different skills, beliefs, in ways in which they're moving throughout the world. And there's a lot of survival skills we hold too, right? Many of us know how to grow our own food. We know, like, if something were to collapse in our society, most folks in our county could probably survive, right? Or they know the farmer who has the resources they need, right? There's this web of connections when disaster comes in which they, could figure out, right, how to move through that disaster.
It strikes me that ethics of interdependence is something that, there's so much work going on right now to try to recognize more broadly across scales and scale up in different ways in this time of change. So our last question before we open to audience Q&A, and I hope you all are thinking of whatever question you'd like to ask. But what do you see as possible roles for institutions like MIT in the future of these questions?
Yeah, so I honestly struggled a little bit with this question because being from Greene County, growing up there, living there for so long, we see these like reporters or like institutions coming in, getting their information, their data, their stories, and then just leaving and not doing anything with it. And so I was like, I don't really know. That's all I've really seen. And so just talking to like Veronica and other people at MIT, I realized that's not what's happening here. And so it's really hard for me to just think of ways that you might be able to help. But I think just caring, just coming in there, being a presence, helping us get real, tangible, practical solutions to our problems is just vital. And I just really appreciate that going on right now. And then just researching like specifically about like investing in infrastructure, how that can be more important than like just bringing in a cracker plant, like some simple solution like that. A lot of people think like plants like that could really help, but just more research around like investing in infrastructure and that kind of thing I think would be really, really important.
Yeah, acknowledging that this is a much bigger project. I'll give you an example of how we worked with other educational organizations. So Waynesburg University's in Greene County, I don't know, 2,500 students, something like that. They've partnered with Carnegie Mellon, which has a much bigger research capability and data crunching type of thing on 2 projects specific to Greene County. The first one was food distribution problems, and the data of that solution was 11 distributed pantries throughout the county for the food bank, right? So it used to be we would ask everybody to come in. Well, we know there's a transportation issue. And the solution to that was the efficient distribution in 11 different smaller pantries of how you get food out to people. So that was an education, a data problem, an educational solution that's implemented now. So now we deliver food out into smaller areas. They're currently working on a public transportation study, which is going to be fielded this summer, collect data on a small bay, I think 5 vans that are going around, because we have no public transportation. If you live in West Waynesburg, and you have to go to Carmichael's, which is about 12 miles away, you can't get there. We don't have Uber, we don't have Lyft, we don't have any public transportation. The county runs a van for very specific qualified populations, and most of us don't qualify, right? So there's a problem there. To the larger question, I use this term, this statement all the time. Greene County's been living in the shadow of our neighbors for way too long. And that includes West Virginia and our Commonwealth neighbors, Washington and Fayette County. Our population does not allow us to have political capital. Both of our state representative and our state senator could get reelected without Greene County voting. Right? So when you go to Harrisburg and you're divvying out money, this is natural. It's not against either one of those individuals. If you're a politician, where do you spend money? Where you get votes, right? So for decades we've been left behind, and that's I can give you the math on it. It's very simple to figure out. But organizations, educational organizations, may be able to put together the packages, federal probably, that the data sets that would argue it's time to invest in our rural communities. And I think that small project with transportation's one, a small project with food distribution one, a bigger project like this, and the data available and the academic capital that can be invested into an argument that says, hey, it's time to invest in these kinds of projects in this rural community before it's too late. And I've said before, and I may retract these words later, it's already too late. I mean, we were 20 years behind making this recognition, and if we can't substantially change things with some of these initiatives, like keeping people in Greene County, the farther you go down, the harder it is to do, right? Population decline, quality of your schools, the deficit in the county budget, the farther you go, the harder it is. I haven't given up yet. I'll retract the too late part of that, but it's a hard argument. But I think there's a valid role for academic partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I always talk about when it's like, what can institutions that do research, I think it's really important to educate on the second level of extraction that can happen in communities, right? So our resources are being extracted by energy companies, by systems, but journalists, big NGOs, academia can also come in, collect data, stories, publish them for their benefit only. And that in and of itself is also extraction. And I just wanted to say that, right? Because most of you are probably going to go into a career somewhere already in a career of research. And so I think when you're starting projects, there's really important questions you can ask yourself. And I think in this process, MIT did do this, right? Is like, is this research something the community actually wants or needs to, right? So is it wanted? And how will the end product of the research benefit the community? How will it be shared within the community? How will it help increase their agency, their decision-making power, right, to move forward? And then the other thing, which is happening more and more with institutions, especially in the academic sector, and what we really did through this process with MIT is like participatory and collaborative projects. Which we had a great lunch conversation yesterday, and it's like, that's great, and it's also like counter to the entire academic institutions often, but as like the new wave of researchers, of folks working, it's like also your responsibility to start to push back on that system, right, and to shift it in a way. And so and this also, like doing this participatory, collaboratory research is beneficial because it also shares the access people in academia have had to analytical synthesis skills with those community members, often who didn't have the privilege to go to college or to experience these opportunities, but it doesn't mean they can't learn it working in a participatory and collaborative process side by side. So then you didn't just go into that town, right, and collect data and give them a fancy report. You went into that town, you collect data, you gave them a report, and you advanced their leadership for the long term to figure out how to address solutions. And so I think that's really where institutions like MIT and other research or academic places really need to start looking at and shifting in how they're working with one another. And I mean, this process, through a pandemic, right, we still tried to figure out how to stay engaged, how to still have conversations, how to understand what's going on, and really be more participatory and less like, I'm the researcher, right, you're the entity that we're studying.
I think a good example of a smaller project was the white paper that came out about the coal asset value changes in Greene County. And then that was a lot of work. I don't have time to do that work every day, right? Because I'm doing a different job. But somebody that picks up a project and that's for a grade or wherever they're at in their academic career, it's extremely valuable and an outsider's perspective. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we can skew the numbers to make it look like what we want to see, right? Statistics.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much to all the panelists. For me, that's all such a continuing reminder of why it's so hard to change and why it matters so much to try. And I want to stop there and open up for what questions you might have for our panelists. And Brianna has a mic.
Yeah, I'll pass the mic. I actually have a question I'd like to start off with. So yesterday when we were talking, I heard a little bit about water quality as a big challenge or problem for your region, and it made me think about sort of the way that environmental issues are portrayed or discussed in the county. And I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit about, water, drinking water in particular, is such a fundamental core kind of necessity that you think might be a connecting or bridging sort of issue. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how environmental issues come into play and how that kind of dynamic works in the county and across different sorts of interest groups.
I'll tackle drinking water, you tackle...
You're the one, Tonya, working with residents now, but I'm happy to answer.
Okay. Just a little bit. I do work very closely with residents that are impacted by water, not only from coal, but from oil and gas, but it's all very similar. And so, yeah, it is a bridging kind of conversation that people have. It does bring people together because at the very least we need clean water for anything that we do in the county. If we don't have that, people aren't going to stay, people aren't going to move there. And so that is a very basic need that brings people together. And that brings different issues together too, whether it's oil and gas, coal, like different industries dumping into the Mon, which is a river that we use for our water source. And so, yeah, I'll let you.
I just think the only thing I would add to that is, especially when you're not there, there's this assumption of like, oh, well, if X oil company destroyed your water, you now hate, right, X oil company. But a big understanding that folks get the complex dynamics in the community, right? They understand that that industry is playing a critical economic role, and when they screw up my water, they should fix it, right? It doesn't just drive people to be anti-fracking. And I think that's hard to get when you're not in those communities, right? In those dynamics, that it's not black and white. Often there's a lot of complexities to it. There's a lot of realities around it. And I think, you know, when I was directing the Center for Coalfield Justice, the first thing we would say is, you know, an abrupt shutdown in the coal operations would be a loss to the county. Are we also very concerned about climate change and the climate crisis and what's happening? But is it, and people get that at a very granular scale that are living in these communities, that like, yes, I'm upset my water is polluted, and you know, why can't these operators just treat us with dignity and respect? Like, part of the problem is these companies are not actually treating residents with dignity and respect in the ways in which they're moving through our communities.
Here's an example of our drinking water specifically problem. There's a water authority, a quasi-governmental agency, right? One of the struggles we have at the county all the time is assigning responsibilities. They go, well, you're in Greene County, this must be yours. Well, we're not an authority. We don't do sewer or water. I'll help you put some in the ground, but I'm not going to manage it or own it, right? So there's a water authority that for a decade has been selling bad water to their customers at a premium price. And it's poor management, corrupt boards. It's been bad. So that's our Flint, Michigan, right? The problems that they experienced, that was lead and all that. Ours is contaminated water going through a system that's not prepared to make it drinkable. People have had to reinvest in washers and hot water tanks and all of those appliances that water goes through. It ruins clothes. They can't drink it. So they pay $100 a month just as a bill, and then they go to Walmart or Costco or somewhere and buy their drinking water for them. For, I don't know, 6 or 8 years, nobody did anything about it. We're involved now trying to get it sorted out. But the legal issues that go along with that, the board issues, the county has no influence over board members of an authority. It's huge. We're now advocating for a buyout of 1 or 2 large companies that could take it over, fix it, right, and get it. But that's a 3 or 4 year project. So we're going to go into a 12-year plan or 12-year session where people have not been able to drink their water yet. They're paying for it. So, I mean, those are huge issues.
And I think in terms of the future, that's critical, right? Like, you know, I talked about how we are predicted from a climate perspective to be one of the most livable places. That is if and only we don't destroy our freshwater resources, right? So it is like where pollution goes, how it's treated, all of that accountability on the fossil fuel industry is critical because they are only as profitable as they are right now because they are consistently externalizing these costs onto communities in our county and across the world.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. So let's open up the room for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hands. We'll bring you the mic because we're recording.
Hello.
Hi.
My name's Kaelan Graham. I'm a researcher on just transition topics at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. And I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective today. Also, personally, as an Australian, I feel like we have a lot of similar challenges back home. So I've really enjoyed hearing you talk. I wanted to touch on two of the things that I feel like shone through were tax revenue and local jobs. I heard that in all of your talks to some extent. And I wanted to kind of touch on the extent to which we think federal government policies like the IRA can help with that. So there's the energy communities tax incentive that specifically aims to target energy communities, and a lot of Western and Southwestern Pennsylvania is part of those, I believe. But these are just like investment, incentives, and they don't necessarily address the jobs piece. I'm wondering whether you think that is not enough, or whether you think maybe that's where the federal government is best placed to help, and then leave some of the more local issues around local jobs and community kind of re-engagement to more local authorities. Thank you.
Yes, I think there's an investment the federal government needs to look at we get a lot of, we'll take care of you, right? Rural communities are this is important. I want your demographic so I can put it in a grant. Here's a good example. But we never get the results back from that. It's a lot of unpaid lip service. So most recently, the federal Build Back Better, IJA, those kinds of programs, right? Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission commits to putting one in. They're looking at robotics and artificial intelligence. We have dirty drinking water in Dunkard Township, right? So I make the argument at SPC, equality is, I don't have an issue with using the term equality or everybody should be treated equally and have the same kinds of things. But let's look at the quality of life when we talk about equality. And if you don't have clean drinking water, should we be addressing artificial intelligence? In a windfall of funding. I mean, if institutions are investing in it, or companies or industry, that's their business because they have a business model that they're going to go after a profit and it's going to give jobs. I get all that. But if it's a windfall of money, federal or state, should we not look at the quality of life that people are living before we invest in the next step? Right, so that's a piece of that. I think we've done a relatively good job on looking at workforce development in the transition. One of the things, and I can't remember, somebody brought it up, blue collar industry families are generationally resilient, coal miners included. So when a coal mine closes and 400 miners are out of work, our workforce development people see 20 of them. The other 200 or whatever the math was, I forgot my number. The balance of them have a CDL driver's license, or they're a welder, or they can you run a backhoe. They already have a secondary career path that they're qualified in, and maybe they need to update their certificate or something, but they knew going into that coal mining industry that their job was up and down, right? And it really came to fruition in 2013, 14, 15 when we lost 5 of 9 mines. We didn't have 15% unemployment. All those individuals already had a secondary skill because they knew they had bills to pay and mortgages and so forth, and they simply transitioned. Some of them left to do that. You get population decline, but a lot of them just stayed and they picked up a water truck or a construction vehicle, or they went on the welding pipelines the next day. So generational resilience will keep people in place. The ability for our specific industries to compete on a larger scale with like wages is troubling sometimes. People will move. Now the loyalty seems to be less. I mean, 50 cents an hour, people are jumping career paths. But they do have that. But back to your first point, I guess, it's hard for government to invest in the smallest of populations because they don't get anything back. They don't get votes back. They don't get a substantial tax increase back, right? We're overlooked all the time. And I use that all the time. We're living in the shadows of our neighbors. The rich get richer in terms of amenities, investment, infrastructure, school quality, and the poor either stay where they're at or they get poorer.
I think one of the things I would add, so I do think the job question is a little bit easier than this tax revenue question, right? I think that's still the hurdle we're sitting in Greene County. A lot of other places are sitting in, because it's hard. It's just like, it's also a less tangible concept, I think, for a lot of folks too, right? Like, taxes just count on my paycheck, I pay them, they go to the government, maybe the government does something with them, maybe they don't, right? It's just like more abstract in the general education or understanding in communities, where like people very much get like, I need a job to pay my bills, and like, what do I do next, and what is a job? Like, that just seems way more tangible. With these big federal packages, I think, so it's interesting, like the IRA, and we have our previous fellow that was with CCJ last summer who wrote comments about the community environmental quality screening tool that the government put together. And that was an interesting process, right? When the beta version of the tool came out, nothing in Greene County was on it as a like disadvantaged or high priority community. Then we wrote Catherine wrote amazing comments. We submitted them, so did other people throughout the climate environmental justice communities with advice and impacts, and we got 2 townships out of the whole county that qualify out of it. So a lot of the county, according to who should be prioritized and how they're trying to run these grant programs, aren't actually considered disadvantaged in the tool. And the way they're wanting to move the money so quick, even the programs that could go to nonprofits, it's a large sum of money to an environmental justice nonprofit whose budget has been $50K, and now you want to take $1 million government grant that you cannot spend a penny on in advocacy as well, right? Because any federal money is not allowed to be used to sway political perception or opinion or policy, where a lot of environmental justice organizations are not direct serviced organizations, right? They are rooted in changing the policies to work better for them. And so that's a big administrative hurdle. You're asking a lot of, the government right now is asking a ton of under-resourced organizations to take on. And the risk is not grave, right? Like, the risk is a felony and jail time and a shutdown of your operations if you mess up. So there's a lot of EJ leaders I know right now who are excited and also like, I don't want to be the one, right? Like, to accidentally make a mistake with this money. And also a lot of governments too. A lot of rural governments at the township level, they're, Mike and I talked about this, they're road crew managers, they're farmers, they don't even have a paid treasurer or secretary, so who's gonna track this money? And the other thing, I think the IRA has a lot of opportunities. A lot of it is rooted around tax breaks. And I think there's a real question around, okay, well, if you're a renter, right, or you're not a homeowner, like, you're not really getting any of those tax breaks. Or if you're not owning a home, you don't have enough money to go buy an electric vehicle and get the tax break for the electric vehicle you couldn't purchase in the first place. So it is gonna boost, I think, our upper working class, middle class significantly, but it's still gonna leave out poor folks in our society. I think through the last couple of years and how money moved, which was the most powerful, was the American Rescue Plan Act. It was just, here's a sum of money to every township, to every county, to every state, with very little restrictions. Talk within your government, talk within your communities, and figure out how to spend it, right? And if you're an organized community, you could just go to your township and be like, here's what we need, or gave a real transparent conversation to happen between township and constituents of, actually, we have a $40 million deficit, and this, $7 million just came in, like, we have to use it for our deficit, which means we don't raise your taxes, right? But if we didn't get this money, we had to raise your taxes. Or in some counties, it has been a really cool program where residents are going to the county and saying, let's create rent abatement programs at the county level and use the ARP funds. Now, I know there's like a huge, Laura's from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is sitting on a large sum of the ARP funds and doing nothing with it, when there's like millions of people across the county that could really benefit from this money going into programs too. And so, but I do think that is a model that actually gives more power to local control in how to use an investment from the federal government versus requiring local communities to compete and bid against one another to be the more deserving, right, community to get the grant.
And then we'll go to Chris.
Okay. Since you said my name. Yeah, so two things, actually. I looked back, I was going to tell you about this. I looked back at the CEJST, and they've come out of beta, so they're on their final version now, and they added abandoned mine lands, and so I think that added Dunkard.
Yeah.
So Dunkard is now eligible, and maybe something else along the Mon. But to my actual question, so I'm from West Virginia, as you two know, I'm starting to think about, and I think we are, as a state, starting to think about sort of severance taxes and coal severance taxes. And Mike, you were talking about this a little bit. And I'm thinking about, like, how do we recoup those particular things? And I suspect that fracking has some severance taxes associated with it. No, it doesn't. Okay.
Pennsylvania has no severance tax.
No severance taxes.
Nope.
That's news.
There's the impact fee.
Yeah, so there's an alternative, and I'll just tell you, this is my personal opinion. When Pennsylvania started in the unconventional well drilling business, lobbyists from Oklahoma, Utah, northern Texas, that knew what the industry was, the tax was going to cost them, went to Harrisburg, lined the pockets of legislators, I'll say that, lined the pockets of legislators and told them, do not accept a severance tax in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the only state in the United States that does not have a severance tax on natural gas wells. We have a impact fee, which by most calculations is about 1/6 of a severance tax equivalent. That impact fee goes to Harrisburg. It's charged at the wellhead by the number of heads and the volume. It's good for 15 years and then it drops off. And we have been shorted since the early 2000s, 5/6 of the equivalent of severance taxes in Pennsylvania.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess I'll amend my question then a little bit. But you were talking about sort of losing the value of income from the coal mining. And so I'm wondering if you see, I don't know if solar brings the same value, or if you see other opportunities through renewables to bring that value into the county.
The county has signed an option, and now it's gone into another phase, but that term never comes up. It's a lease of property for whatever. You might as well put a warehouse on it, right? It's a taxable investment in the county for whatever that value is, but there's no severance tax on solar energy. Or wind, I would think. I mean, you're not using anything up. It's going to be there forever. You know, the real severance tax, the philosophy behind, I guess, is that's a one-time. Every coal car that goes down the rail line and goes to wherever it goes for power, we never get back, and that's why it's taxed that way. Natural gas, they missed the boat. I mean, I don't have any other explanation, and it would have been larger than coal in value.
Can I comment about that? Yeah, and then Chris is ready to ask a question, but if it's related, yeah, sure, just comment back.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting. How is this on, or
Yep.
is it good enough? You know, coal, when it was structured coming into communities like yours and many others, was a real benefit to these communities in the way that these things are set up. And what we're finding is that as new energy technologies come into play, they're getting tax breaks as opposed to supporting the communities that they used to be. I mean, states are competing for wind and solar to come to their regions, and so they're trying to lower the tax revenues from wind and solar. So just the opposite is happening, which puts communities at a real disadvantage when trying to explore and attract these different companies and support the tax base.
Let's go with Chris's question. He's been waiting patiently, and then Aaron, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Brianna, we only have 5 more minutes. Is that right? Yeah. So I'll make this really short. My name is Chris Noble. I work for Environmental Solutions Initiative. I work on partnerships with corporations that are collaborative for our agenda. Sorry, get out of your way. I want to get back to the question about what can universities like MIT, far away from your local situation, how we can help. And I want to resonate a bit with what this gentleman was saying about Australia. I had some experiences with companies in rural communities in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. Very similar, blue collar, closely knit. Germany closed basically all their coal mines in the 60s and 70s. It was very, very disruptive for communities. And there must have been a lot of Greene counties there, right, who were trying to figure out, was the lack of resources that you have on how to get out of it. And I'm wondering if we can find examples of things other people have done that we can help you have some visibility on. So first I'll get back to the question about what can we do to help, and certainly listening to you is a big step for us, but is there something we can do to help you be aware of what other people out there who have had the same problems as you, how they faced them? Maybe this is something you've talked about. Maybe you can comment about that track of where we could help you.
There are some, Ohio Valley Institute, Sean O'Leary has done some work like that. There's another article that I pulled not too long ago about Germany and the transition out of that kind of stuff. So I think there are examples of recovering economies. If they're on level footing with their neighbors, it makes it easier, right? We just have a list of so many distractors, from the tax structure to the quality of schools to the people leaving to the quality of our water. I mean, you just go down the list, and even if people want to help, they end up in the wrong county, right? They end up north of us or in Morgantown, West Virginia. I do think there's value in looking at models that were successful. Centralia comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've also have talked with folks from those places in Germany through my organizing history around it too. So there is kind of an organizer to organizer connection that has happened. The Just Transition Fund actually wasn't able to go on it, but they took residents from Appalachia and the coal fields to the coal fields of Germany and did these exchanges. And those are really beneficial, right? When you actually get to talk hand in hand with the people. I think before COVID started, we were talking about how could we get our local government leaders in southwestern PA just to even go down to eastern Kentucky, right, and see and learn from one another. I think the biggest question, solutions are great. If you're seeing a solution, I think the specific solution I've been trying to see, is it out there and does this exist, and this was the question I brought to John in our very first Zoom call after he cold called me, was, is there an example anywhere in which a community has actively started to transition and diversify before the dominating industry collapsed? And most of the examples are collapse, devastation, rebuilding, right? And so this is kind of the now $1 billion question. Is there a process to shift systems or to work with local communities to start to see, right, the writing on the wall, the decline in the industry that's dominating, and diversify and come out? And I think why that is so difficult, and has been in many places, is often that dominating industry isn't just dominating the economy, they're corrupting and dominating the entire political system within those communities, right? So they are pushing out any other competition that would make people less dependent upon them. And so, yeah, I would love globally to see researchers do an assessment, figure out what's going on. Does that exist? But that's our challenge, right? We talked about why PA doesn't have a severance tax. There's more than a 1-to-1 ratio of oil and gas lobbyists to legislator in Pennsylvania. So we could try to talk to our legislators every day, but they got a lobbyist assigned to them, talking to them every hour about what they should or shouldn't do. And so I just think you can't actually separate the political and the politics around this from what's moving forward, because it's what kept us where we are. It's often why commissioners previously in Greene County ignored and didn't act, right? They were being talked to from those industries to say, don't worry about it, we promise you we'll come back, everything's okay, and they just trusted them, but the industry didn't come back, right?
we're going to need to wrap up here, so I want to just say a couple last comments, but I wanted to ask Amy if there's anything else you wanted to add before we finish.
No, just appreciation for the chance to have this conversation and together with you all, and look forward to continuing it collectively.
Okay, thank you. So these are exactly the kinds of conversations and the sorts of partnerships we hope to continue to develop through the Environmental Solutions Initiative and the Climate Justice Program. So I want to, again, thank you all for being here and being part of this public launch, but especially Veronica, Mike, Tonya, and Amy. Thank you so much for joining us, coming all the way here from Pennsylvania, and we look forward to more conversations together. And one last mention of our event coming up on Thursday. We hope you can all be there with us. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I hope to see you all again soon.